Before the First World War, before hundreds of millions of people died for the cause of freedom, there were no passports. There was no income tax. There was no sales tax. There was no draft. Governments did not control the money supply, or if they did, they were on the gold standard and were limited to the amount of money they could print because they had to back it up with gold. There was no nationalization of key industries. There were no farm subsidies. There was no welfare state. There was no military-industrial complex. There was no old age pensions. And I know some people think those things are good, but they're terrible. In terms of government power over the individual, I'm just looking at the big picture here. I'm just looking at the big picture. Because if an agency says that it wants to protect my freedoms, that it is fighting and that people, tens of millions of people have died to make me free, then all we really need to do, my friends, all we really need to do is to look at the world and the state of freedom within the world before this massive genocidal, murderous series of wars for the liberty of the human race. We need to look at how free the world was before these wars began and how free the world is after these wars were ended. That's all I'm asking. We don't have to have opinions. We don't have to make things up. We don't have to find hidden or key or mysterious ways of looking at these conflicts. All we have to do is say, what was the purpose? What was the purpose? Well, the purpose was, you see, to make the world free. The purpose was to make the world free for democracy and so on. Well, what happened? Are we more free after all of these bloody genocidal murderings of hundreds of millions of people, wars? Are we more free or are we less free after these wars for freedom? It's a relatively simple question, isn't it? And there's no need to be subjective in our answers. There's no need to be subjective in our answers. One of the things that propelled the growth of militarism throughout the world was the Great Depression of the 1930s, which was created after governments got control of the money supply, began printing way too much money, which caused the hyper bubble of the 1920s. And then when that began to be too unstable, there was too much inflation, they cut back on the money supply printing, which caused the bubble to collapse. And then they began to hyper-regulate the economy. This is as true in the United States as it was anywhere else in the world. They raised tariffs 40 or 50%. The entire system of international trade collapsed in the 1930s. They cut the money supply by 40% in America in the early 1930s, thus creating and prolonging a depression that was staggering in its effects on the world. This is after the First World War that was supposed to make the world safe for democracy, that was supposed to bring freedom. It was supposed to bring freedom, and what it brought was governments out of control with counterfeiting, which destabilized, caused problems, destroyed the middle class, put millions of young people out of work, threatened the ruling classes with a possible revolution. If you look at the 20th century, what you can get from that, this is not my lesson, this is objective, this is a fact, that we are about 5% or maybe 10% as free now as we were at the turn of the 20th century, between 1899 to 1907, you could say, where no passports, private currencies in many areas, no government supply of national industries, no income tax, no draft, no military-industrial complex, no national, very, very small national debts. You could move anywhere, go anywhere, live anywhere. Where are we now? After this whole century, hundreds of millions of people died for our freedoms. What is the state of our freedoms relative to before all of this began? What has happened since? What has been the effect of all of these wars against government power, against dictatorship, against the expansion of the state class, against a military-industrial complex? What has been the result? Let's just look at the before and after. It's only 100 years. We're not talking about going back to ancient Athens here. What has been the result of all of these wars for freedom? Of all of these tens and hundreds of millions of people who cried and bled and died for freedom? We are much less free.